Welcome theater addicts, my name is Madison Steele and today I'm going to be reviewing The Green Knight as a part of the Cascadia project at Studio 1398 on Granville Island. The Cascadia project is essentially a series of new plays. There are 6 plays, 2 on each night, and I'm going to be reviewing The Green Knight. So the 2 plays that I'm going to be reviewing as a part of this series are 8 Ways to Fate and All and Oaks. So what I know about these plays is 8 Ways to Fate and All is meant to be sort of a tribute, or I guess a discussion of the opioid crisis in Vancouver, especially in the downtown east side. Oaks is kind of about a family. The description is a little bit vague, but from what I understand it's kind of about like the resilience of family and what it means to be a part of a family. That's sort of what I get. I'm looking forward to seeing these plays. They are student projects, so they were put together by master's students and a professor from UBC. I've never heard of any of the people who are working on these productions, so I'm not familiar with the work, which is kind of exciting because it's always good to see like new playwrights in Vancouver. I think I'm looking forward to seeing people tackle the opioid crisis. They are master's students and professors from UBC, so you know, I wonder if they're going to be taking like an intellectual standpoint on the crisis, or like what that's going to look like. It actually doesn't say in the program or specify about whether they have consulted with anyone who's been affected by the opioid crisis, or whether they've discussed with anyone who actually lives on the downtown east side, or you know, has had some form of addiction. So I'm also curious about that, because I think with this topic it's important to be very sensitive and to understand the roots of this problem, and to understand that it is very real and that it does affect a lot of people. So I'm curious about how they sort of deal with that. I've genuinely made so many different versions of this video because I believe that this is a topic that deserves to be engaged with carefully and thoughtfully, and in a way that can help push the topic further, rather than kind of you know, just spewing it everywhere, or you know, making a mess of it, or you know, or worse, like you know, pulling it backwards. So there were 2 plays that we got to see back to back. The first one is called 8 Ways to Fate and All, and the second one is called Oaks. A big part of the Cascadia project is about the place in which these plays were written. So each play is kind of talking about a specific place. The awesome thing that we do in Vancouver is that before every theater production, or almost every theater production that I've seen, especially in the smaller theaters and the ones at Granville Island, is there's an acknowledgement that the play is taking place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations peoples. So the way that the acknowledgements took place at the top of 8 Ways to Fate and All came across as being quite disrespectful. The gentleman who went up and did the acknowledgements kind of said, you know, okay, so the last thing for me to do is to just acknowledge that the show is taking place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. They didn't really give us permission to do this, but we're grateful anyway. And then, you know, the audience kind of laughed, and it felt like a big toss away of something that we do to show respect to those nations and the Indigenous peoples who still, you know, live and have always lived on this territory. I just want to say that regardless of this review or how I felt about the show, there's always room to grow. So nothing that I'm gonna say here can't be changed, can't be re-looked at, can't be revisited, and I think that the exciting thing about making a new play is that there's so much room for that, and that you can always grow and you can always make it better. 8 Ways to Fate and All, in the program and you know, also online, it's described as talking about the opioid crisis. So from my understanding, In Vancouver specifically, the opioid epidemic has most acutely affected the residents of the downtown east side in Vancouver. And when we're talking about the downtown east side, we're talking about poor folks, we're talking about people of color, we're talking about Indigenous people, we're talking about people with disabilities, people with mental illnesses, we're talking about a lot of people in the LGBT community, and none of that was acknowledged in 8 Ways to Fate and all. So part of the issue with this is that when you're engaging in a specific topic, for this show in particular, it was the opioid crisis in Vancouver, you need to acknowledge all the different stories of the people that this has affected. The way that my friend put it, which I thought was really awesome, was that if you're talking about Vancouver in a piece of art and you're not engaging with Indigenous stories, you've already failed. There was also a lot of statistics and facts kind of being spewed at us, but none of them involved any of these stories of the more vulnerable populations of people. So they, essentially erased half of the story. The next thing that I want to talk about in this production was the literal portrayal of an overdose or multiple overdoses, as well as addiction. I think it's really, really tricky for modern and I guess today's theater to attempt to do what film does so well, right? Like when we see a film and we see someone who is, overdosing, they're literally at their house in their bathtub, and yes, it's on the screen, but they have the capacity to make it so much more realistic than we ever could on stage. And so with that understanding, I think that that's an opportunity to make some more interesting choices and to kind of delve deeper into it. Whenever you have the impulse or you want to do a literal portrayal of something extreme or triggering on stage, I seriously encourage you to ask yourself why. Why do I need to portray this literally? What is that going to convey to the audience? What is that conveying to the actors who are in this production? Because with this piece, it didn't make it more realistic, in my opinion. As an audience member, I didn't feel any more invested in what I was seeing because they were doing it realistically. In fact, I felt a little bit more isolated. It felt very performative. There wasn't a lot of grounding in the circumstances of the play, and there was so much going on all at once with like multiple people speaking and screaming and crying that I just really couldn't understand what was happening from an emotional standpoint, and it made me pull back. Another thing that kind of struck me with this play was their use of statistics. So there's one scene in particular where they're kind of firing out a lot of numbers and statistics at us. And while they acknowledge that they are throwing out these statistics and that maybe the audience isn't going to be invested in them, I think to assume that the audience wouldn't be invested in statistics that directly affect the city that we're in, I think is maybe making a poor assumption about the audience. Especially if you're, not someone who's been directly affected by it, the statistics can really like give you an idea of what's going on. Just to pull another quote from my friend, she says, the problem is in the process and the evidence is in the product. So this is so true for this show. The problem was in their process. They didn't consult anyone who is a part of the community that they were talking about. They didn't really kind of engage with the topic deeply enough. And that all happened in the process of the creation of this show, and the result that we got was what I saw, which came across as being quite culturally insensitive and as not engaging fully with the topic that they wanted to kind of change people's perspectives on. It didn't really accomplish what it wanted to accomplish, which, according to the program, was inform, open conversations, and transform attitudes. Again, I'm not sure who they consulted for this production, but I think as a general rule of thumb, it's super important to consult the community that you're kind of speaking about. Oaks was written by Fiona Reville. I was actually surprised that this was a new play. This felt to me like a play that maybe had been written in the 1960s. It was super, super well done and very, very carefully written. Reville's writing almost reminded me of A Streetcar Named Desire, or like that kind of style of play. It was a little bit, you know, it was a period play, so it was set a while ago, but it was also had some like incredibly modern language used, and it was a really, really interesting mesh of old and new. What I loved about this play is that it was so simple. They didn't move around too much, there wasn't too much going on, there were only 2 characters in the play, and everything kind of had this beautiful simplicity. There were some moments when the dialogue would get quiet, and while I was still listening and I was still super invested, you could kind of hear that it was raining outside, and for some reason that made it so beautiful. There was no music going on, no one was screaming, it was just a really, really simple, intimate piece. It was easy to follow what the actors were doing on stage because they were genuinely listening to each other when they spoke, which is so, so special to see. They played a brother and sister character, and I genuinely would believe that they were brother and sister. Their connection was really strong, their listening was really strong, and their engagement with their circumstances was really, really strong. It felt like we were right there with them the whole time. It was funny, it was, you know, strong, it tackled some really fascinating topics, and what I also really liked about the writing is that it kind of left a little bit of ambiguity. So she didn't give everything away. You know, she kind of left some of it up for us to figure out, which I think in some ways gives the audience a lot of credit and allows us to kind of make decisions for ourselves, and that doesn't always happen in theater, and it's really, really exciting when it does. The only thing that I want to maybe critique about this show was that they used a big cardboard tree on stage to represent the oak tree that was in the piece. There's something about a big false tree on stage that makes it feel like a little bit like a high school production. This show did not feel like a high school production. The acting was top tier, really, really good. But having that big tree on stage kind of made me not really sure about, what kind of production I was seeing a little bit. There's also something about going really literal with the tree that reminds me as an audience member that, oh, in a film, this could be like a real tree. In a film, it would be just an oak tree that they filmed at. And so I think in theater, that gives us a little bit more like wiggle room and opportunity to kind of make some more interesting choices with it, to get really imaginative and to kind of like say like, well, how could we do this in a way that's going to be extra engaging, rather than just going for like the literal tree, what could be a, an exciting choice. Other than that, I thought the show was really well done, really nice and simple, easy to follow. I could let myself go and enjoy the show, which was fantastic. So thank you for that. My name is Madison Steele, and I just reviewed The Green Knight as a part of the Cascadia project at Studio 1398 on Granville Island. We're working on getting a full list of all the productions that happen in Vancouver, including I think dance and I think improv. Like, subscribe, leave us a comment if you came to see this show or these shows and you had a different opinion or you kind of wanted to get your 2 cents in. Please, please, please leave us a comment. We want to hear from you, and we want all the diverse perspectives that we can get.